New York made room for people with money, power, and confidence. For people like me, it offered narrow sidewalks, overdue bills, and the constant pressure of pretending everything was under control. That morning had already gone wrong before it even pushed open the café door. My subway card had failed twice. Lily's daycare payment was due by Friday. My phone kept lighting up with reminders I didn't need because fear had already memorized every deadline better than I ever could. I had worked the late shift the night before, slept barely 3 hours, and still woke before sunrise to iron a blouse that hid how exhausted I was. Survival had become a science to me. Every dollar had a destination before it even reached my account. Every hour belonged to someone else. Lily, on the other hand, moved through life like the world had been built to delight her. She skipped beside me in her little yellow coat, asking questions faster than I could answer them, her curls bouncing as if they had their own separate joy. At 5 years old, she had no understanding of rent, late fees, or the quiet panic that could sit in a mother's chest all day without showing on her face. She noticed pigeons, clouds shaped like dragons, strangers' shoes, and whether the moon had looked lonely the night before. She could turn an ordinary walk into an expedition. Sometimes I envied her for it. Most times, I was just trying to keep up. The cafe on Lexington was our small luxury. Not because I could afford it, but because once a week I let myself buy one coffee and one muffin and pretend life was not closing in from every side. It was warm, polished, and full of people who looked like they had nowhere urgent to be unless it involved a boardroom, a merger, or a driver waiting outside. The kind of place where expensive watches flashed beneath cuffed sleeves and nobody glanced at the prices on the menu. I did. Every time. I was reaching into my purse for exact change when the atmosphere in the room shifted in a way I felt before I understood. Conversations lowered. Heads turned. Even the barista, who had been moving with the bored rhythm of a morning rush, suddenly straightened. That kind of silence did not happen for ordinary people. Then he walked in. Alexander Pierce. Even I knew that name. Everyone in New York knew it. His face had stared out from business magazines and checkout lines and giant financial headlines online. Billionaire CEO, ruthless negotiator. The man who bought failing companies, cut them apart, rebuilt them, and somehow made the world call it brilliance. Pierce Global Holdings had its name on half the skyline, and Alexander Pierce carried the kind of reputation that made grown men rehearse sentences before entering a room with him. In person, he was somehow worse. Taller than I expected. Sharply dressed in a dark coat that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent. Controlled in the way powerful men often were, as if emotion had been trained out of them years ago. His face looked carved rather than softened by life, all restraint and severity, and his eyes swept the room with the detached precision of someone who was used to being obeyed without ever raising his voice. He looked like a man who had never been laughed at in public, which was exactly when Lily tilted her head, stared directly at him, and said, far too loudly, "Mommy, why does that man look like Mr. Grumpy Pants?" The cafe went dead. Not quiet. Dead. Heat rushed to my face so fast it hurt. My hand tightened around my wallet. For one horrible second, I could not breathe. A spoon clinked against a saucer somewhere in the back, absurdly loud in the silence. I turned toward Lily so quickly my chair scraped the floor. "Lily," I whispered, my voice thin with panic. "That is not polite." She blinked up at me, confused, not ashamed. "But he does." I wanted the floor to open. I wanted the lights to go out. I wanted to grab my daughter, leave the coffee, leave the muffin, leave the city if necessary. Instead, I looked up and found Alexander Pierce, standing only a few feet away, his attention fixed entirely on us. Or rather on her. I had expected irritation, cold dismissal. Maybe the kind of humiliation wealthy people delivered without ever sounding cruel. I had already started forming an apology in my head, something respectful and quick, something that would get us out before this became a story he told later as a joke about the poor woman and her ill-mannered child. "I'm so sorry," I said, forcing the words out. She didn't mean. He did not look at me. His gaze stayed on Lily, and something unreadable moved across his face. Not anger. Not amusement either. Something stranger. Something almost startled, as if her voice had reached a part of him the rest of the world never touched. Lily, fearless as ever, studied him right back. "You look less grumpy close up," she announced. A man near the window choked on his coffee. My humiliation deepened. But Alexander still didn't react the way he should have. If anything, the sternness in his expression cracked by the smallest degree. Not enough to call it warmth. Just enough to feel impossible. He crouched slightly, lowering himself to Lily's height, his expensive coat folding with the movement. The whole room watched like it had forgotten how to do anything else. Then, for the first time, his eyes lifted to mine, and what I saw there turned my stomach cold. He wasn't offended. He was looking at Lily like he was trying to remember where he had seen a ghost. Then he asked, very quietly, "How old is your daughter?" For a moment, the entire cafe seemed to shrink around the question he had just asked. "How old is your daughter?" The words were quiet, controlled, almost casual. But something in the way Alexander Pierce said them made my stomach twist, like someone had pulled a thread loose from a memory I had tried to bury years ago. I swallowed before answering. "She's 5. His eyes did not leave Lily's face. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Around us, people pretended to return to their coffees and laptops, but no one was actually looking away. When a man like Alexander Pierce spoke, rooms listened. Everyone knew who he was, even if they pretended not to stare. I had seen his face enough times on magazine covers while standing in grocery store lines, balancing Lily on one hip and calculating whether I could afford strawberries that week. Headlines about billion-dollar deals. Corporate takeovers. A man who could dismantle entire companies without raising his voice. Journalists loved calling him the cold architect of modern finance. People whispered something else. They said Alexander Pierce never smiled, not in interviews, not in photographs, that not even when Pierce Global Holdings announced profits large enough to make the stock market flinch. The story around him had grown into something almost mythical over the years. A boy from nothing who clawed way to the highest levels of American power. A man who trusted spreadsheets more than people. A CEO who walked into negotiations like a surgeon entering an operating room, calm, precise, and prepared to cut his employees, feared disappointing him more than losing their jobs. His rivals feared sitting across a table from him. And yet here he was, crouched slightly in a coffee shop, staring at my 5-year-old daughter like she had just said something that cracked open a door inside his mind. Lily leaned forward, completely unbothered by the tension radiating through the room. "You're very tall," she said thoughtfully. I felt my face burn again. "Lily, sweetheart." "But he is," she insisted. A few quiet chuckles escaped somewhere behind us. Nervous ones. The kind people made when they were unsure whether they were witnessing something funny or dangerous. Alexander didn't react to them. His attention stayed fixed on Lily, studying her in a way that made my pulse start to race. Children usually shrank around powerful adults. They sensed authority the way animals sense storms. But Lily didn't. She simply tilted her head and examined him the same way she studied pigeons or street performers. Like he was interesting, not intimidating. "You're not smiling," she observed. Her voice was innocent, but the statement landed like a challenge. Alexander Pierce, the man newspapers called ruthless, merciless, brilliant, seemed almost caught off guard by the comment. His jaw tightened slightly, and for a second I thought the moment had finally crossed the invisible line between awkward and offensive. I grabbed Lily's small hand. "I'm really sorry," I said quickly, standing up. "She's very curious. We didn't mean to disturb your morning." My instinct was simple. Leave. Before this turned into something humiliating. Before someone in this room decided a woman like me shouldn't even be standing in the same space as a billionaire CEO. I gathered my purse and Lily's tiny backpack, trying to move with quiet dignity even though every step felt like it echoed across the cafe. But just as I toward the door, a calm voice stopped me. "Wait." One word. Not loud, not angry, Yet the room froze again. I turned slowly. Alexander Pierce had straightened to his full height, and now he was looking directly at me for the first time. Up close, his presence felt even heavier, like standing near a thunderstorm that hadn't decided whether it would break. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he glanced back down at Lily. "You called me Mr. Grumpy Pants," he said, his tone unreadable. Lily nodded proudly. "Yes." Another long silence followed. Then, to my complete shock, the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. Not quite a smile, but close enough that several people nearby looked genuinely startled. I had the strange sensation that the entire café had just witnessed something rare, maybe something no one had ever seen before. Lily studied his face carefully, as if trying to confirm what she had just accomplished. "You almost smiled," she said. Something flickered across Alexander's expression again, something softer that buried under layers of restraint. But just as quickly, the emotion disappeared, replaced by the controlled composure that had built his reputation. Except now his eyes had changed. They weren't cold anymore. They were searching. Slowly, deliberately, his gaze moved across Lily's face, her curls, her eyes, the small dimple near her cheek when she spoke. Then he looked back at me, and the question he asked next felt far heavier than the first. "Does she live with you here in Manhattan?" I hesitated. "Yes." Another pause. His expression tightened again, like he was calculating something only he understood. Then he asked the question that made my chest go cold. "What's her full name?" I felt the air leave my lungs, because the way he asked it didn't sound like curiosity. It sounded like recognition. And suddenly I had the terrifying feeling that Alexander Pierce wasn't just looking at my daughter, he was trying to remember why she looked so familiar. "What's her full name?" The question settled in the air between us like a fragile glass that might shatter if I answered too quickly. For a moment, I considered lying. It was a strange instinct, but it rose inside me immediately, sharp and protective. Every mother develops a quiet radar for danger. Sometimes it isn't loud or obvious. Sometimes it's just a shift in the air, a subtle tightening in the chest that whispers something important is about to change. And standing in front of Alexander Pierce, I suddenly felt that warning. Lily swung our joined hands back and forth, completely unaware of the weight pressing down on the moment. "My name is Lily Carter," she announced proudly before I could stop her. The words left her mouth like a small stone dropping into still water. Alexander's eyes sharpened. Not dramatically. Not in a way most people would notice. But I saw it. I saw the exact second something inside his mind began turning over, slowly rearranging pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving. "Carter," he repeated quietly. My throat felt dry. "Yes," I said quickly, forcing a polite smile. "Just Lily Carter. It's a common name." The explanation sounded weak even to me. Alexander didn't respond immediately. Instead, his gaze drifted back to Lily's face, studying her with a focus that made my pulse thud harder. She stared back with cheerful curiosity. "You're still a little grumpy," she informed him. A couple of people nearby shifted awkwardly. Someone at the counter pretended to scroll on their phone while clearly listening to every word. Alexander didn't look offended. He looked thoughtful. That might have been even worse. His eyes moved slowly across Lily's features, her curls, the shape of her cheeks, the way her eyebrows lifted when she spoke, the small crease near her nose when she concentrated. Then his gaze lifted back to me. "How old did you say she was?" 5, I answered again. "And you live here in Manhattan?" "Yes." The questions were simple, casual even. But something about the way he asked them felt deliberate, like each answer was sliding into a calculation only he could see. I forced a small laugh, hoping to lighten the tension. "She's very talkative with strangers," I said. "I promise she's usually better behaved." Lily frowned immediately. "I am behaved." Alexander's mouth twitched again, almost amused. But the expression faded quickly, replaced by that same searching look, and suddenly I understood what he was doing. He wasn't just making conversation, he was comparing memory against reality, and the realization sent a cold ripple through my chest. Because there was a memory I had spent 5 years burying deep enough that it wouldn't surface in quiet moments. 5 years since a night that had changed my life in ways I never expected. 5 years since I met a man I believed I would never see again. At the time, Alexander Pierce had not been the figure dominating business headlines. He had been ambitious, intense, and restless, standing on the edge of something massive he hadn't yet built. We had met at a charity event I attended while working as a catering assistant. He had looked completely out of place among the polished donors, like a storm waiting to move through a room full of sunlight. I remembered how easily we had spoken that night, how surprising it had felt, how temporary it had always been. People like him did not orbit the same world as people like me. Even then, the distance between our lives had been obvious. The memory ended where it always did, with a goodbye that carried no promises. And a positive pregnancy test 3 weeks later. I tightened my grip on Lily's hand. Coincidence, I told myself. That was all this was. Manhattan had millions of people. Children resembled strangers all the time. I had spent years telling myself exactly that whenever Lily made a certain expression or laughed in a way that reminded me too much of someone else. I cleared my throat. "Well, it was nice meeting you," I said carefully. "But we really should go. Lily has, she has your eyes." The sentence interrupted me so quietly that it took a second to realize what he had said. Alexander was still looking at Lily, but his voice had shifted slightly. Not curiosity anymore. Recognition. My heartbeat stumbled. "I'm sorry," I asked. He tilted his head slightly, studying her again. "The eyes," he repeated. "They're very distinctive." I forced another polite smile. "Children get features from everywhere," I said lightly. "Grandparents, relatives, sometimes people they aren't even related to." Alexander finally looked directly at me again. And for the first time since this conversation started, something sharp moved behind his calm expression. "You're right," he said slowly. Then he added something that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "Although 5 years ago," he continued quietly, "I remember meeting a woman at the Astoria charity gala who had exactly the same shade of eyes." My lungs stopped working. That event. No one else in this cafe should know about that night. No one. Alexander's gaze never left my face as he finished the sentence. "She worked with the catering staff," he said, "and she spilled a tray of champagne glasses because someone startled her." The memory hit me like ice water. The sound of shattering glass, the embarrassment, the way a stranger had helped me pick up the pieces instead of laughing like the others. A stranger who had introduced himself simply as Alexander. Slowly, painfully, I realized something terrifying. He remembered. Not the event, not the donors. Me. My fingers tightened around Lily's hand as a wave of cold understanding spread through my chest. Because the way Alexander Pierce was looking at my daughter now wasn't curiosity anymore. It was calculation. And as the truth began forming inside my mind, I felt the color drain from my face. Because suddenly I understood something I had never prepared for. The man standing in front of me might not just recognize my past. He might be recognizing his daughter. The moment Alexander mentioned the Astoria charity gala, something inside my chest collapsed quietly. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just the slow realization that the past I had carefully sealed away had somehow found its way back into the room. For 5 years, I had lived my life like someone guarding a fragile secret behind locked doors. Every decision I made, every job I took, every apartment I chose had revolved around protecting one thing: my daughter's peaceful life. And now the one man who could unravel that life was standing less than 6 feet away from her. I forced my breathing to stay steady. "You must be mistaken," I said carefully, though the words sounded weaker than I wanted them to. Alexander didn't argue, he simply watched me with that same unsettling patience, the kind that powerful men develop after years of negotiations where silence often reveals more than words. Lily tugged gently on my sleeve. "Mommy," she whispered loudly enough for half the cafe to hear, "why are you sweating?" I wiped my forehead quickly and forced a small laugh. "It's warm in here." But the truth had nothing to do with the temperature. The truth was standing in front of me wearing a tailored coat and a billionaire's composure. and memories I had locked away were beginning to break through. 5 years ago, Alexander Pierce had not been the man newspapers feared. He had been ambitious, sharp, and restless in a way that felt almost electric. Back then, Pierce Global Holdings had been growing fast, but had not yet turned him into the intimidating figure dominating financial headlines. At the charity gala, he had moved through the room like someone uncomfortable with attention. That was the first thing I noticed about him. The second was that he didn't talk down to people. Not to the donors. Not to the waitstaff. Not to me when I accidentally dropped a tray of champagne glasses after someone bumped my elbow. Most guests had laughed. Alexander had knelt beside me on the marble floor and helped gather the broken stems like it was the most normal thing in the world. "You look like you want to disappear," he had said quietly that night. "I do," I admitted. "Don't," he told me. "You didn't break anything important." I remembered the strange ease of that conversation. How we ended up talking for nearly an hour in a quiet corner of the terrace, where the city lights spread below like stars. For the first time in a long while, someone had looked at me like I was more than a struggling girl balancing two part-time jobs. He had listened, really listened. But even then, there had been distance in him. Alexander Pierce had always seemed slightly detached from everything around him, like a man already walking toward a future no one else could see. That night had been intense, unexpected, brief, and when the event ended, our lives moved in opposite directions as if the moment had never happened. I never heard from him again. 3 weeks later, I found out I was pregnant. I still remembered sitting alone in my tiny apartment bathroom, staring at the test in disbelief while the city hummed outside the window. Fear had come first, then confusion. Then the quiet realization that the man who might be Lily's father was already becoming someone untouchable. Even back then, Alexander's name had begun appearing in financial headlines more frequently. His company was expanding aggressively, acquiring businesses across multiple industries. He was building an empire. Men building empires rarely paused to raise children with women they met once at charity events. And deep down, I knew something else. Even if he wanted involvement, power came with control, legal teams, influence, decisions made in conference rooms instead of kitchens. I had grown up watching wealth dictate the rules of other people's lives. I refused to let it dictate my daughters. So I made a decision that felt terrifying but clear. I would raise Lily myself, quietly, without asking for help from a man who might see fatherhood as another asset to manage life after that became simple the hardest possible way. Work, childcare, rent, groceries. Repeat, no headlines, no boardrooms, no billionaires. Just a mother and her daughter building a small life together inside a city too big to notice them. Until today. Now Alexander Pierce stood in front of Lily, still studying her face in that careful, searching way. And I could see the pieces moving behind his eyes. He wasn't guessing anymore. He was testing the truth. Lily, completely unaware of the storm forming around her, had wandered closer to him again. "You're less grumpy now," she told him. Alexander's gaze softened briefly before returning to me. "You said she's 5, he said calmly. "Yes. And you've lived in Manhattan the entire time?" "Yes," I repeated, my voice tighter now. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something inside his mind. Then he crouched slightly again, bringing himself level with Lily. "What school do you go to?" he asked her gently. "Mommy says I'm starting kindergarten soon," she said proudly. Alexander's eyes flickered upward toward me again. Something about that look made my chest tighten. He stood up once more, his full height casting a quiet shadow across the table. Then he asked the question that made my heart stop. "When is her birthday? When is her birthday?" The question hung between us like a wire pulled too tight. For a moment, I couldn't answer. My mind raced through the years I had spent building careful walls around Lily's life. Every form I filled out at school, every doctor's visit, every document that listed only one parent. I had constructed a quiet, fragile world where the truth existed only inside my own memory. And now Alexander Pierce was standing in front of me, asking the one question that could break it, June 17th. I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes did. It was subtle, like a door closing somewhere deep behind his calm exterior. A calculation finishing itself. He nodded once. Then he looked down at Lily again. "Well," he said softly, "that makes you almost 6. Iole smiled proudly. Yes, for a moment I expected another question. Something sharper. Something that would push the conversation further into dangerous territory. But instead, Alexander straightened his coat. "It was nice meeting you both," he said calmly. Just like that. No accusations. No confrontation. No dramatic realization, if anything. He looked almost composed. Too composed. I forced a polite smile, though my hands still felt cold. "Yes. You too?" Then he turned and walked out of the cafe. The room slowly exhaled as the door closed behind him. Conversations resumed in cautious murmurs. Chairs shifted. Cups clinked. The world moved forward as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside me, everything felt different. Lily looked up at me. Confused. "Mommy," she said, "why did the grumpy man leave so fast?" I knelt beside her and brushed a curl away from her forehead. "Because he's probably very busy," I said gently. But even as I said it, a deep unease settled in my chest. Men like Alexander Pierce did not walk away from unanswered questions. They investigated them. Across Manhattan, the glass tower of Pierce Global Holdings rose above the skyline like a monument to ambition. By the time Alexander stepped into the private elevator that carried him to the executive floor, the calm expression he wore in the café had already hardened back into the controlled demeanor that built his empire. But one thing had changed. He could not stop seeing the child's face. Lily Carter, her eyes, the shape of her smile, the way she tilted her head when she asked questions. Details most people would dismiss as coincidence had locked themselves inside his mind with uncomfortable precision. When the elevator doors opened, his chief of security was already waiting outside his office. "Mr. Pierce," the man said. Alexander stepped inside without slowing. "I need information," he said simply. The door closed behind them. Minutes later, a thin digital file appeared on the security chief's tablet. "Who are we looking into?" the man asked. Alexander stood at the window overlooking the city. "Evelyn Carter," he replied. The name felt strangely familiar when he said it aloud. Discreetly, he added, "No corporate channels." The security chief nodded. Within hours, the quiet machinery of wealth and influence began moving background checks. Address history, employment records, everything that could be legally accessed without drawing attention. By evening, the first report arrived. Alexander read it alone in his office. Evelyn Carter, 29, 2 part-time jobs, no criminal record, no lawsuits, no scandals, rent payments always late but never missed entirely. A modest apartment in a neighborhood far removed from the polished streets where Pierce Global executives lived. There were medical records for Lily Carter, school enrollment forms, pediatric visits, everything consistent with a child raised by a single mother without outside financial support. Alexander leaned back in his chair slowly. If Evelyn had intended to hide the child from him, she had done it without exploiting his wealth. There were no child support claims, no attempts to contact him, no legal filings. Nothing. That detail bothered him more than anything else, because it meant Evelyn had not been waiting for him to appear. She had simply moved on. Another report arrived the following morning, a photograph from Lily's daycare application. Alexander stared at the image for a long time. The resemblance that had unsettled him in the cafe looked even clearer in the photograph. Not identical, but familiar in ways that refused to be ignored. For years, Alexander Pierce had lived his life with ruthless clarity. Profit and loss, strategy and consequence, every decision made through logic. Emotion had never been a useful business tool, but now a quiet, unfamiliar thought had begun to grow in his mind. What if the child was his? He stood from his desk and walked back toward the window overlooking Manhattan. For the first time in years, the skyline felt strangely distant. A life he had built through discipline and control suddenly seemed incomplete in a way he had never allowed himself to consider. Behind him, a soft knock sounded on the office door. His security chief stepped inside holding a sealed envelope. "The additional test you requested," the man said carefully. Alexander turned slowly. "What kind of test?" the man asked. Alexander took the envelope. "DNA," he replied. The office fell silent. For a moment he simply stared at the document in his hands. Then he slid one finger beneath the seal and opened it. Inside were the results, and whatever truth they contained was about to change everything. Alexander Pierce stood alone in his office, the envelope still open in his hand. From where I stood across Manhattan that same evening, I had no way of knowing that a single sheet of paper had just rearranged the foundation of a billionaire's life. But somehow, deep inside, I felt it. The moment he opened those results, across the city, Alexander stared down at the report that his security team had placed in front of him. For most people, a DNA test was a medical document. For Alexander Pierce, it felt like a verdict. The numbers were precise, clinical, impossible to misunderstand. Probability of paternity 99.98%. His fingers tightened slightly against the paper. For several seconds, he didn't move. The man who had built a corporate empire through ruthless clarity suddenly something unfamiliar clouding his thought shock. Not because the result was entirely unexpected, but because it was now undeniable. The little girl in the café, the fearless child who had called him Mr. Grumpy Pants, without hesitation, was his daughter. 5 years old. 5 years of birthdays he had never attended. 5 years of scraped knees he had never helped clean. 5 years of bedtime stories someone else had told. A strange mixture of emotions rose in his chest, colliding in ways Alexander was completely unprepared for. Anger came first, not directed at Lily, not even fully directed at Evelyn, but at the simple reality that a piece of his life had existed for half a decade without his knowledge. Then came regret. He walked slowly toward the glass wall overlooking Manhattan, the city glowing beneath him like a map of ambition. Alexander Pierce had spent the last decade conquering industries, technology, real estate, logistics. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals without hesitation, destroyed competitors with cold precision, built a reputation so intimidating that most executives rehearsed their arguments before entering a room with him. Control had always been his greatest advantage. Yet somehow, the most important thing in his life had happened completely outside his control: a daughter. And he had missed everything. Behind him, the quiet knock of his chief advisor interrupted the silence. "Our Silers." "Pierce." Alexander folded the report carefully and set it on his desk. "Come in." 3 senior advisors entered the office. People who had spent years helping him navigate legal storms, financial battles, and public scrutiny. They had already guessed why he requested the DNA test. One of them spoke first. "We assume the results confirmed your suspicion." Alexander didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at them. "Yes," he said finally. The room grew quiet. The oldest advisor cleared his throat carefully. This situation could become complicated. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "In what way?" The advisor shifted slightly. "You are one of the most visible corporate leaders in the country. A previously unknown child appearing in your life could raise questions. Media attention. Legal complications." Another advisor added cautiously, "If the mother seeks financial support retroactively, it could become a public case." Alexander's expression hardened slightly. "She hasn't." The advisors exchanged brief glances. "No legal filings." Alexander continued calmly. "No attempts to contact me, no demands." That fact still sat strangely in his mind. Evelyn Carter had raised Lily alone for 5 years without trying to benefit from his wealth. Most people would have done the opposite. His advisors were silent for a moment before the first one spoke again. "In that case, you may want to consider distance," he suggested carefully. Discretion. The quiet financial support without public involvement. Alexander stared at him. For a man who built his reputation on logic, the suggestion made perfect strategic sense. But something about it irritated him. A quiet memory surfaced. Lily's voice inside the cafe. "You almost smiled." Alexander exhaled slowly. "No," he said. The advisors looked surprised. "No," one repeated. Alexander walked back toward his desk. "For 5 years, My daughter has lived a life I knew nothing about. He said calmly. The word daughter sounded unfamiliar in his voice. He continued. That will not continue. The advisors fell silent, because they knew that tone. When Alexander Pierce made a decision that, reversing it was nearly impossible. Meanwhile, across the city, I was sitting on the edge of my small apartment couch while Lily colored pictures on the floor, crayons scattered around her like bright little pieces of calm. But my mind kept returning to the cafe, to Alexander's questions, to the way he looked at Lily. The possibility that he now suspected the truth had begun to grow into something impossible to ignore. I had spent 5 years building a life that belonged only to us, just me and Lily. No lawyers, no billionaires, no complicated power dynamics. But now the future felt uncertain in a way I couldn't control. Lily looked up from her drawing. Mummy. Yes, sweetheart. She held up the paper proudly. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands, one tall, one medium, one very small. That's you, she said, pointing at the medium figure. And that's me. I smiled gently. And the tall one, she shrugged. Maybe a friend. My chest tightened. Because somewhere across Manhattan, the man who might soon step into that empty space had already made his decision. Back in his office, Alexander Pierce reached for his phone. He stared at Evelyn Carter's address displayed on the screen. Then he gave a quiet instruction to his driver, prepare the car. He paused for a moment before adding the words that would change everything. I'm going to see them. The knock on my apartment door came just after sunset. Not loud, not impatient, but deliberate. I had been expecting it since the moment we left the cafe that morning. Every passing hour had carried the quiet pressure of inevitability, like watching a storm slowly approach across an open field. Lily was on the living room floor again, building a small city out of plastic blocks. Mummy, someone's here? She said cheerfully. I already knew who it was. My hand hesitated on the doorknob for half a second before I opened it. Alexander Pierce stood in the narrow hallway outside my apartment, his tall frame almost too large for the dim space. The expensive coat was gone now, replaced with a dark jacket that somehow still looked like it belonged in boardrooms and glass towers rather than aging apartment buildings. Behind him, the hallway light flickered faintly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. You found my address quickly, I said quietly. That tends to happen when people have resources, he replied calmly. At least he wasn't pretending. I stepped aside without another word. Come in. He entered slowly, his eyes taking in the small apartment without judgment, but with a careful awareness that made me strangely self-conscious. The furniture was simple, the paint slightly worn, the kitchen visible from the living room. A life built on survival, not luxury. Lily looked up from her blocks and immediately brightened. It's Mr. Grumpy Pants. I closed my eyes briefly. Alexander looked down at her, and to my surprise, the faintest hint of warmth appeared in his expression. You still remember me, he said. Of course, she replied matter-of-factly. I cleared my throat. Lily, sweetheart, can you finish your drawing in your room for a few minutes? She frowned slightly. But I'm building a tower, just for a little while. After a moment of hesitation, she gathered her crayons and wandered down the short hallway toward her bedroom. When her door clicked shut, the apartment felt suddenly smaller. Alexander turned toward me. I received the results, he said. My chest tightened. There was no reason to pretend anymore. I assumed you would, I replied. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a folded document on the small kitchen table between us. I didn't need to open it. The answer was already written across his face. She's mine, he said quietly. Hearing the words spoken aloud felt different from imagining them. More permanent? Yes, I admitted. The silence that followed stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. I braced myself for anger, for accusations, for legal threats. Men with Alexander Pierce's power didn't usually approach problems gently. You should have told me, he said eventually. The sentence wasn't harsh, but it carried weight. I considered it, I replied honestly. His eyes lifted toward me, and decided not to. Yes, why? The question was simple, but the answer carried 5 years of quiet decisions. Because men like you don't just enter a child's life, I said. You take control of it. Alexander's jaw tightened slightly. That's an assumption. It's reality. I folded my arms across my chest. You were already building your empire back then. Lawyers, advisors, investors. You think any of them would have encouraged a billionaire CEO to quietly co-parent with a waitress? He didn't respond immediately, which told me enough. I wasn't protecting myself, I continued quietly. I was protecting her? Alexander walked slowly toward the small window overlooking the street. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring out at the city. When he spoke again, his voice sounded different, less controlled. You may have been right. That wasn't the answer I expected. He turned back toward me. I've spent the last decade building companies, he said, acquiring competitors, negotiating billion-dollar deals. His eyes drifted briefly toward Lily's closed bedroom door, but none of those things prepared me for the idea that I already have a 5-year-old daughter. There was something raw in the admission that made me pause. I missed everything, he continued quietly. Her first words, her first steps, 5 birthdays. The regret in his voice sounded genuine, but I couldn't let that soften me too quickly. And now what? I asked carefully. You show up and take over. Alexander shook his head slowly. No, the word surprised me. I'm not here to take her away from you. My skepticism must have shown immediately. You have the money to do it? I said. Yes. You have the lawyers to do it. Yes. And the influence. Yes. I waited. He exhaled slowly, but I won't. The room fell quiet again. Alexander stepped closer to the table. When she looked at me in that cafe, he said, she didn't see a billionaire CEO. A faint, almost embarrassed smile crossed his face. She saw someone who needed a better nickname. Despite everything, I felt the smallest crack in my resistance. She's honest? I said yes. He replied softly. And that honesty did something I wasn't expecting. What? It reminded me that I built a powerful life, he said, but not necessarily a meaningful one. His gaze met mine. I'm not here to control Lily's life, he continued. I'm asking for a chance to be part of it. The words were simple, but they carried enormous consequences. And if I say no, I ask quietly. Alexander didn't hesitate. Then I'll respect your decision. That answer surprised me more than anything else he had said. But then he added something that made my heart twist again. However, he said carefully, she still deserves to know who her father is. The truth of that sentence landed heavier than any threat could have. I looked toward Lily's bedroom door. 5 years of protecting her. 5 years of being enough for both of us. And now the possibility of a future that included someone else. Someone powerful. Someone complicated. Someone who might genuinely care. Slowly, I realized something frightening. The hardest decision of my life wasn't behind me. It was standing directly in front of me. For a long moment after Alexander finished speaking, neither of us moved. The apartment was quiet except for the faint sound of Lily humming to herself in the next room. It was such a normal sound. So ordinary. Yet somehow it carried the weight of the decision I had just made. All right, I said slowly. Alexander looked up. You can be part of her life, I continued carefully. But it happens my way. He didn't interrupt. No lawyers controlling schedules, I added. No turning her into a headline. The no using your money to replace the life she already has. His response came without hesitation. Agreed. Something about the speed of that answer made me pause. Powerful men usually negotiated every detail. They measured every concession. Alexander Pierce simply accepted the terms. It was the first sign that something inside him had already begun to change. From the hallway, Lily's small voice suddenly called out, Mummy. Yes, sweetheart? Is Mr. Grumpy Pants still here? I closed my eyes briefly. Alexander almost smiled. Apparently, he said quietly, that name is permanent. I sighed. Lily, I called. You can come out. Her bedroom door opened instantly, and she skipped back into the living room holding a crayon drawing. When she saw Alexander still standing there, her face lit up like she had just discovered something wonderful. You didn't leave. No, he replied. She walked straight up to him and held out the paper. I made this while you were talking. Alexander took the drawing carefully. 3 stick figures. One tall, one medium, one very small. This one is Mommy, Lily explained. Alexander nodded. And this one is me. He nodded again. Then she pointed to the tall figure. That one is you. Something flickered across his face as he looked at the drawing. You added me, he said quietly. Yes, she replied simply. Because you looked lonely. The room went silent. For a man who had built his reputation on ruthless control, Alexander Pierce suddenly looked like someone who had no idea how to respond. After a moment, he cleared his throat. Well, he said gently, thank you. Lily studied him again. You look less grumpy today. I almost laughed. That was the beginning. Not dramatic, not perfect. Just the slow, awkward start of something new. The changes didn't happen overnight. Alexander didn't suddenly become a warm, carefree father. At first, he was careful, measured, almost nervous around Lily in a way that seemed impossible for someone who dominated corporate boardrooms. He visited on weekends, sometimes after work, sometimes just long enough to read a story before Lily fell asleep. The first time she asked him to build a block tower with her, he stared at the pieces like they were a complicated financial report. You've never done this before, have you? She asked. Not exactly, he admitted. Don't worry, Lily said confidently. I'll teach you. Watching the billionaire CEO of Pierce Global Holdings take instructions from a 5-year-old was one of the strangest moments of my life, but something about it felt right. Slowly, the rigid edges of Alexander's personality began to soften. He listened when Lily talked. He asked questions about her drawings. He even learned how to braid her doll's hair after one particularly determined lesson. And somehow, their nickname remained, Mr. Grumpy Pants. At first, it embarrassed me. But eventually, I realized it had become something else. Not an insult. A kind of affection. Meanwhile, the outside world began noticing something unusual. Inside Pierce Global headquarters, employees whispered about the change in their CEO. Alexander Pierce still ran his company with the same sharp intelligence, but the icy distance people once feared had begun to fade. Meetings ended earlier. His temper became rarer. Once, during a major negotiation, an executive from another firm jokingly asked if Alexander had finally learned how to smile. To everyone's surprise, he actually did. The financial media tried to explain the shift. Some called it strategic maturity. Others said it was the natural evolution of a powerful leader. No one guessed the real reason. A 5-year-old girl who believed the most intimidating man in Manhattan simply needed a better nickname. Months passed, and something inside our small apartment slowly transformed, not into a fairy tale but into something real. Alexander never tried to erase the life Lily and I had built. Instead, he fit himself into it piece by piece, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes quietly, but always sincerely. One evening, while Lily was asleep on the couch after an exhausting day at the park, Alexander sat across from me in the dim living room. She's extraordinary, he said softly. I smiled faintly. She's stubborn. That too. He looked toward the sleeping child. I've spent my entire life believing success meant control, he admitted. Now I'm learning it might mean something else. What? He watched Lily breathe peacefully beneath her blanket. Showing up, he said. For the first time since I met him 5 years ago, Alexander Pierce looked completely at peace. And as I watched him gently adjust the blanket over his daughter's shoulders, I realized something remarkable. The same little girl who had embarrassed a billionaire in a crowded café had quietly changed his life. She had taught him patience, humility, and something even more powerful, how to love. But neither of us realized yet that Lily's influence would extend far beyond our small apartment. Because one day, the girl who called a billionaire Mr. Grumpy Pants would also reshape the future of Pierce Global itself, and the legacy Alexander Pierce would leave behind.